Hi, I'm Kate Davern, and today I'm going to be teaching you about domain and range. If you don't know what domain and range are, domain is the set of all x values, and range is the set of all y values. Let's look at some examples. So if we wanted to list the x values, then we would write -1, 0, 1, and 2. If we wanted to list the y values, we would write -1, 0, 1, and 2. But this is not a proper way to write domain and range. There are three different ways that we can write domain and range, but the first one we'll talk about is roster notation. Roster notation is probably the simplest. So here's a list of example points, and we're going to write the domain and range for them in roster notation. So first, let's list the domain, which is all the x values. So 3, 7, -1, and 6. So when you're writing domain and range in roster notation, you have to use one of these squiggly things, and then you have to list all the x values in numerical order. So the first would be -1, because it's the smallest, then 3, 6, and 7, because it's the largest. And then you would put another little squiggly thing. So now let's try it with the range, which is all the y values. So it's the same thing. You need a squiggly, and then write them in numerical order. -3, 2, 4, and 5. And that's roster notation. Let's try another example. So now let's list these in roster notation. So starting with the domain, can't forget the little squiggly, and let's start with the smallest number for the x value, sorry. So smallest one would be 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and then 5. Now let's try with the range. So looking at the y values, the smallest one is -5, then -2, -1, 0, and 3. Oh my god, that was really bad, sorry. Okay, so the next way of writing domain and range that we're going to look at is set notation. So for set notation, you can write the domain like this. A is less than x, which is less than b, if x can't equal a or b, or you can write it like this. A is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to b. So you would write this if x could equal a or b. And then for range, you would write the same thing. A is less than y, which is less than b, and a is less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to b. So now let's do an example. So how would we write this in set notation? So since the dot is open, we know that it can't be either of these. It can't be less than or equal to. So we know that x is going to be anything greater than 0, because it can't be anything less than 0, and it can't be 0. So x is greater than 0. So for this example, we have a closed dot over the 3, so we know that x can equal 3, and the arrow is pointing to the left, so we know that x can be anything less than or equal to 3, because it can't be anything above 3 because there's no arrow over there, and since the dot is filled in, that means that it can equal 3. So our third and last way to write domain and range is interval notation. So for interval notation, we can write it like this: a comma b with parentheses, and if it has parentheses, that means that x cannot equal a or b. And we can also write it like this. A comma B with brackets. So if it has brackets, then that means that x can equal x, A, or B. So let's look at some examples. So for this example, we have a number line with an open dot over the 0 and a line going towards to the right of the 0. So for this one, we're going to have to use parentheses because x can't equal 0 since it has an open dot over it, and because this arrow goes on forever, and we know that x can't equal infinity, so we have parentheses. So first we're going to write the smallest x can be, which is 0, and we put that first, and then we write the biggest that x can be, which is infinity. So we put parentheses to show that x can't actually equal these, but we still write them down as the smallest and the largest values that x can equal, because x can get very, very, very close to 0 and very close to infinity, but it can never equal them. Let's do another example. So for this example, we are going to write both set notation and interval notation. So we're going to start with set notation. So we see that there's an open dot over -1 and a solid dot over 2. So we know that x can't equal -1 and it can equal 2. So we know -1 is less than x, not less than or equal to because it's an open dot. And we know that x is less than or equal to 2. Less than because the line is on the left side of the 2, and equal to because it's a filled in dot, so x can equal 2. So now let's write it in interval notation. I'll write that that's set notation. So now let's write it in interval notation. And because this is an open dot, we know that we're going to have to use parentheses, -1. And this is a filled in dot, so we know that we can do 2 with a bracket. So this is interval. So let's do one more example and then we'll go over roster notation. So for this example, I've already written the set notation. So now we're going to put that onto the graph. So let's see. 2 is less than or equal to x. We know that that means that there's going to be a filled in dot over 2. And less than or equal to 4, so there's going to be a filled in dot over 4 because x can equal both 2 and 4. So then we're just going to connect these, and it's that easy. So now looking at this, let's write the interval notation. So since these are both filled in dots, we know that we can use 2 brackets. And the lowest value is 2, and the highest value is 4. It's that simple. So now let's practice some more roster notation. Okay, so here we have some example points. So let's look at all the x values. We have 0, -3, -5, and 1. So write domain, squiggly, and the lowest value is -5. So we're going to put that first, then -3, then 0, and then 1. So there we have domain. So now let's look at range. So all the y values are 5, 1, 7, and 2. So the lowest is obviously 1, then 2, then 5, and then 7. So there we have the domain and the range in roster notation. Okay, so now we're going to look at some common mistakes that are made when you're writing domain and range. So when you're writing a set notation and interval notation, it's really important not to mix up your open dots with your closed dots. So if it's an open dot, that means that for set notation, you have to use a less than sign or a greater than sign, because that means that x can't equal A or B. And if it's a filled in dot in set notation, you have to remember it's less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, and that x. So that means that x can equal A or B. Now, a common mistake with interval notation is mixing up your brackets with your parentheses. So you have to remember that brackets mean that there's a closed dot and that x can equal A or B. And parentheses mean that there's an open dot and that x can't equal A or B. Now, some common mistakes with roster notation are to not use the squiggles or to not list the domain and range in numerical order. So like you have to do -1, 0, 1, 2, so that would be right. A wrong example of this would be -3, 5, 4, 2. There are lots of examples of good and bad examples, obviously. These are just two of them. So those are a lot of common mistakes made with domain and range. So those are all the ways to write domain and range that we've learned so far. Thank you, and I hope that this helped you understand it more.